Hello, everyone. Welcome to the web seminar, Beyond the Mailbox, Legacy Archives, and the Complete Migration of Office 365, produced by Windows IT Pro and sponsored by TransVault. Please note that this web seminar will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You will receive an email when the session is available for review. Also, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to type them into the question box on your webcast console. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers. Nick Cavalancia has nearly 20 years of enterprise IT experience, is an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist, and has achieved industry certifications including MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to over a dozen books on Microsoft technologies. Nick regularly speaks, writes, and blogs for some of the most recognized tech companies today on varieties of topics. Darwin Lee is Chief Technology Officer for TransVault. Darwin is responsible for leading the company's products and technology roadmap, service strategy, as well as the company vision. Darwin's collaborative spirit and over 20 years of dedicated IT product management and software expertise have positioned him as a respected leader and key enabler in the company's growth trajectory and its commitment to data transformation through innovation. And with that, I will hand things over to Nick.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here on the call today. The move to Office 365 isn't just about mailboxes. I think that's something that you guys kind of know. You're on the call today, makes sense. And to ensure that every bit of data that your organization needs is available in the cloud. I mean, that's the whole point here. You're going to the Office 365, or you've already gotten there, as the case might be. You're trying to be in the cloud as much as you can. Your archive needs to be part of that plan, or maybe it might be an afterthought for some of you, and you're trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces. That's fine too, but it's got to be part of it to ensure you've got a complete migration. And migrating your archive is no simple task, as just even one factor alone is the amount of data in your archive can be multiples of what your production environment, your production email looks like on a daily basis. And so the question kind of becomes, how can you ensure a complete migration while still making sure that users and IT, that includes you guys because we're about you as well, that you're both productive? And in today's webcast, I'm going to be joined by Darwin Lee from TransVault. We're going to discuss what's it going to take to ensure a complete migration. And as always, if you guys have been on my webcast before, if you've got any questions, you've got any comments, jokes, anecdotes, anything you want to share, it's fine. Stick it in the Q&A box. And I'm going to have that up throughout the entire presentation, and we always want to make sure that you're involved as much as is possible in these and make these as conversational as we can. So let's go ahead and jump in. And the place that I'm going to start is really just by kind of addressing the challenge of, if I can get this to pop over there, there we go. The challenge of getting everything that you need into Office 365. Now, I abbreviated, sorry about that. I ran out of space, and I'm kind of a OCD guy. I don't want to have two lines of title. I want to have one line. So it's O365, so forgive the acronym there for whatnot, the simplification of it. And as I'm thinking about the challenge of getting every single bit of data into your Office 365, I mentioned already that it's just not complete unless you've got your archive. I mean, the whole point of going to the cloud is to go to the cloud. Now, that sounds redundant, but what I mean by that is you moved your email, or you're going to move your email, as the case it may be. You need to go and move everything to the cloud. It just makes more sense. Otherwise, why in the world are you trying to move your email to the cloud but keep your archive on-prem? And I think you guys know that because you're on this webinar today, so it kind of already makes sense to you. You don't have to belabor the point, but it's not going to be complete without an archive. It's definitely not as easy as moving mailboxes, I can tell you that. With mailboxes, it's not exactly as simple as drag and drop either, but it's certainly a lot closer to, let me specify these mailboxes, move it. And the reason for that, we're going to discuss some of this, Darwin and I, today when we talk about some of the complexities that come into play around moving archive data, because there's a question around where it's going to be retained within Office 365, the amount of data that needs to be moved, issues around when archives have any kind of corruption issues, things like that. And then there's other kinds of compliance and security issues that we'll discuss as well that come into play regarding the way that you move the data into Office 365. So it's definitely nowhere as easy as just pick the archive folder or archive mailbox that you want to grab and just stick it up in Office 365. It doesn't work that way. And I think in a lot of ways for your organizations, you have to figure out what defines complete. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation today that also involves a discussion around which data should get moved in. And when you think about complete might have been years ago. The archive, you might have needed 17 years of email. There isn't 17 years of email that anybody has, I think, at this point. But you get my point. Lots and lots of duration of email archived. And now the company's policy is, let's just keep a year. Complete, the definition of what is quote-unquote complete, I'm doing air quotes here in my office, it might change, especially that now that you're trying to figure out how do I move this into Office 365 and what needs to actually go. We'll talk about that. And then also want to talk about what gets in the way of ensuring that you have a complete migration. Some of this is sort of policy and procedure and process that goes on within your organization. Some of it is technological, not barriers, but maybe restrictions, things like bandwidth and time frame and manpower and so on and so forth. There's other issues that come into play, and we're going to talk about some of that today. So the first place where I want to kind of start, and I'm going to bring Darwin into the conversation with me, is to kind of talk about one of the challenges is around compliance pitfalls. And for some of you in the audience, this might be absolutely really of interest to you. You're worried about compliance mandates. Your company is subject to them. The easy one that everyone always throws out, you're a healthcare provider. You have to comply with HIPAA. Whatever it happens to be, almost every company to some degree has some level of compliance, if you think about it, because you do have, if you take any kind of credit cards, PCI does technically apply to you unless you're using a clearinghouse to take care of that. And then you've also got, from there, if you have, let's say, any personnel information, healthcare information, that stuff, it ends up being somewhat subject to making sure there's personal, privacy in terms of there's privacy laws around personally identifiable information. So it is relevant to everybody. It might not be critical for you, but it certainly is relevant, and I think that that's important here. And there's a couple of issues that we want to talk about that need to be in focus, both during a migration as well as sort of after the migration, meaning you've got to plan how you're going to get it there, and you have to plan what it's going to look like, where is it going to sit once it is there, and is it usable, does it maintain the compliance standards and the security issues that we have in play. And some of these issues are things like, let's say, data fidelity, making sure that the data is unadulterated from when it started to when it ended. That it's the same piece of information no matter what and hasn't been modified. That gets critical, and Darwin and I will talk about this in about 2 seconds here, well, maybe 2 minutes, but you get my point, around that the data needs to maintain some level of fidelity so people can, especially from like e-discovery and a legal standpoint, they know that that's actually an accurate record of communication. You've also got things like chain of custody. There's issues around chain of custody where who has access to the data during the migration. For example, if you were to try and migrate, let's say, PSTs. I've got too many TLAs in our industry. They all sound alike. Sorry. You have a PST and you want to move that, but let's say you took the PSTs and you sent that to a provider who then went ahead and migrated it over for you into Office 365. There's a chain of custody issue here, where there's a point in time where you aren't certain that the data wasn't modified. Goes back to data fidelity a little bit here. And then that all kind of comes back into play around whether or not you have an e-discovery capability here. Once the data is put in place, is it put into the right locations in order to facilitate its use after the move for the purposes of e-discovery. So maybe, Darwin, maybe a good place to start when we're talking about compliance and is maybe sort of why it should be a concern to every business that's archiving on premises. And I guess maybe the simple question I'll ask you is, do you think it's a factor for every organization?
Yeah, hi Nick and hi everybody. I think it is a concern for everybody, and this is certainly what we see with our clients. I think most businesses have got multiple compliance standards that they have to meet, either internal or external. So things like GDPR are starting to become a really key focus for a number of our customers. And it's the sort of hefty fines that can come from that really drive people to make sure that they're being compliant.
Perfect answer. Sorry, I kept myself on mute there for a second here. And I agree with you. I think, like I said, I gave a couple other examples myself. I think it is relevant to everybody here in the audience, even though you're not thinking necessarily I have to adhere to compliance to, let's say, HIPAA or SOX or GLBA or those kind of things. There's still, if nothing else, there's still some other issues that kind of come into play with your organization, like I mentioned, around the personally identifiable information, healthcare information, credit card information, and so on. Now, Darwin, I outlined a couple of the considerations around compliance. Did I miss any? And or I guess which one do you think of them is most critical for our audience?
I think you've covered most of them, or certainly the key ones, Nick. Again, the thing that we see is the financial and reputational risks are the ones that are very high concern. It's quite difficult to select the one that's kind of most critical because it's the old adage of it depends. And I think that's one of your favorite phrases from before, because it depends on the industry, the organization, a number of different factors that could affect which one is critical at any particular time.
I'd agree. I like the fact that you're focusing on the financial and reputational risks, because I think in a lot of ways for you guys in the audience, even if you're not concerned about compliance, there's still that sort of aspect of security. We all know that I think at this point, most of the compliance standards have some kind of data security aspect to them. In a lot of ways, as it pertains at least IT, we're trying to make sure that that data is secure. So really this is more of a security play in a lot of ways, meaning it makes it secure so that the company itself or the organization itself as a whole can prove that it's compliant. So even so, this issue of financial and reputational risks, in the same way that if archive data was not made secure, or someone was able to gain access to it, was able to grab intellectual property out of it. I mean, there's a stat from, it's a couple of years back from Osterman Research, and it was some very, very material percentage. I'll make up a number, 71%. That's a totally made up number. But, some material percentage of intellectual property is in email. And I wish I knew what it was off the top of my head. I wasn't expecting to even talk about that. But from that standpoint, if data isn't secure, then you do run the risk of when that information gets out. If you've read any of the cost of a data breach reports from Ponymon, it ends up costing, it's a material percentage. It's something like a third of a company's revenue in the average is the kind of hit that they take. So that's a great point that you made there, Darwin. Let me ask you a question from a standpoint of maybe some of the mistakes that you've seen customers make during an archive migration that impacted some way, I'm assuming negatively, their ability to adhere to a compliance standard of some kind?
Yeah, I guess one of the biggest ones is around things like journal migration and the e-discovery issues that come from that. And I can cover that in a while to explain a bit more about that. The other one I think that we've seen is people trying to do it for themselves, and we've had many cases of people who tried to do it, realised that it's actually, as you said earlier, incredibly complicated, and had to then come and kind of rescue that project.
And in those cases, I'm thinking about where you have to come and rescue the project from a compliance standpoint. Was there a spot where they fell down? I mean, I'm trying to get to maybe a little bit of the nuts and bolts here of during a migration, they made a mistake, and that mistake actually caused them to no longer be compliant or very difficult to prove compliance. Did anything like that come to mind?
I mean, there's certainly bits about chain of custody and where people have attempted to do things manually, because where they don't have the tools, their only option really is to put a lot of manual effort into migrating the emails. And if you lose chain of custody, as we'll talk about in a while, really that's a bad move.
No, that does make a lot of sense there, and I think especially when it comes to the manual standpoint, I know for you guys in the audience, I mean, I've done a ton of migrations in my career, and I know that the focus always is, I just want to see the progress bar get to 100%. I want to take that particular mailbox or that archive, that piece of data set, whenever you're migrating, whatever kind of migration even is, you have some kind of data set you're trying to move, and your focus is, did I get to 100% and I have no errors, or a minimal number of errors, and am I good? And the things that we're talking about here are very much around the issue of you not just thinking about that progress bar, but how are you doing it, and is anything are there going to be any repercussions based on the way that you're doing it? And I think that's kind of where you're getting at, Darwin, a little bit, is they're doing it themselves, and not just they find out that it's hard, but that they're not even thinking about, by doing it a certain way, they are breaking chain of custody. They're eliminating having data fidelity. They're losing credibility around discovery later on down the road. Would you kind of agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And the real danger is some of those things you don't realize until it's too late. You've migrated, you've removed your old on-prem archive, and you have nothing to go back to. And when we have seen that time and time again.
Yeah, this particular challenge really requires a bit of forward thinking, and definitely using somebody that's got some expertise who's done this before, whether it's somebody in-house or someone externally, but make sure it's someone who's thought this through. So let's do this. Let me go ahead on to the next slide here. And talk a little bit here around user disruption. It's one of the other challenges that goes on during an archive migration. As we know, with any kind of implementation of a new solution of some kind, so a new platform, it could be even moving to Office 365 in general, moving your archiving, doing password resets. It doesn't matter, any kind of implementation. The number one factor that's going to make or break it is going to be adoption. And a good user experience is what's going to drive adoption, especially when the company already has, I'm assuming all of you guys in the audience already have some kind of archive solution in place. They're used to that experience. We all know that people don't like to change. None of us really do in a lot of ways. And so having a good user experience throughout where they're not suddenly having to learn a completely different type of interface. They're not having to try to go to their old solution, only realize that it's not there anymore, and they have to call the help desk, and then help desk says, no, you're on the new solution. Instead, there should be communication and training, and all those kind of things come into play, and that helps create this good user experience. Now, there's some required planning that has to go into play. It kind of follows the same theme. We probably should have called this webinar, Darwin, we should have called it plan. Or I don't know what it seems like that's the big
plan
thing.
And communicate.
All of the factors, you have to plan everything here. And some of those factors include things like, which is going to go first. And in some organizations, maybe you're pushing your archive up to Office 365 first so that when your users have their mailboxes there and that is the only place they're going to, you've given yourself enough time to make sure the archives are correct and so on and so forth. And then once users are on that platform themselves with their mailboxes, they have a full data set there with which to work. So that's one way to do it. Or, of course, the other way around, which I think most people do, they focus on let's get the mailboxes up there. And for most organizations, archives are sort of they're not an afterthought, but they're certainly at least thought after mailboxes in general. There's the issue around scheduling that move. Are you doing this in phases, by department, A through Z, doing each letter of the alphabet, whatever it is? Usually there's a scheduling that has to come into play, and that also ties in with scheduling both the move, scheduling training, the scheduling the communication, all that has to happen. Is planning out the cutoff and the switchover time frames. Darwin gave the example of a lot of organizations end up realizing they're in trouble after they've already decided, let's kill the on-prem solution, we're done. And instead, you really should be planning, even as considering in things like compliance and security and e-discovery and discoverability and that sort of thing. You'd plan a cutoff and a switchover time frame in a way that gives you enough time to ensure that those considerations have been met before you move everybody over. Because if there's a problem, you got to figure out how you're going to fix it. And then, of course, things like retention policies. And I mentioned this a little early on around your old retention policy might have been a bazillion years, and now your new retention policy is 180 days or whatever it is for the archive. And so you just got to kind of consider that in terms of from minimizing a user disruption standpoint, making sure that users have been communicated that there's only going to be a certain amount left. And then when that data gets moved and the cutover is made for that user, they understand there's a different retention policy. They're not trying to find something from 5 years ago if you're no longer storing it. Darwin, I'm thinking about this. This sort of seems to be more about getting the data over in a reasonable time frame in a lot of ways. You're trying to minimize the user disruption and that sort of thing. I really didn't talk about how the technological barriers, but I see this as kind of being able to keep users productive by making sure the data they need accessible no matter where it is. Would you kind of agree, and maybe a why I'll throw in there as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think you make a load of really good points there, Nick, and I agree completely. I think, this day and age, users rely on their email data very, very often. And it's critical to them that they don't have things like missing emails, broken links, missing attachments. So you've got to think about the outcome and that doesn't just mean the email user, but those from legal and compliance areas as well. You mentioned there about the IT team and really other stakeholders who are all part of making that migration successful.
Now, I've touched on a couple areas of planning here just around user disruption, but did I miss anything, you think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, communication I mentioned, but I think you've already mentioned that's key, really letting people know what's being planned. Again, the mistakes that we see made are user frustration when they didn't know that their archive was going to be migrated, and all of a sudden things start happening, they're not aware of it. There's other things as well about levers and how you handle those and in what sequence when you're doing the planning. Again, I'll hopefully offer some advice to the audience about what we've seen with levers and how to address those.
No, that's a good point, especially when somebody is leaving the organization or maybe even already has left in a lot of ways. That kind of goes back down to this issue almost of like retention. Do we keep that or not? There might even be different retention standards for that. In fact, let's talk about the issue of retention for a second here. Are you seeing customers maybe reposition their retention requirements as they're going through this process? And if so, is it because of business changes or is it because of a technical limitation, or what is the issue?
Generally, people are tending to retain more. That's our experience. Legislative drivers that say you need to retain. I mean, you said there about PCI. In retail, and certainly in the UK, it's 7 years of transaction history. So there's a number of things that you have to retain. But it's again, what we're seeing is it's kind of a brave person who hits the delete key. And they tend to play safe and just want to retain as much data as they reasonably can. And again, what we're seeing is with the relative cost of storage going down, and things like Office 365, if you buy the right plan, you've effectively got pretty much unlimited storage. People are tending to do that, but although that's feasible, it's possible to do, it's probably not a very sensible thing to do, and I think we'll talk about that in a while.
No, that does make sense. It is sensible from a cost standpoint, but at some point there may be too much information. I guess that makes good sense to me. Let's talk about the third challenge that I've got here, which is just an issue for you guys where you may have what I called copious amounts of data, lots and lots of information. You've got years and years and years of data, and in some cases it might even be having a number of different sources. You've got your on-prem archive solution. You, of course, have your mailboxes. You may even have PSTs, and there's a lot of different sources. And this project can only take so long. And I put so many sources in so little time. I didn't mean that you can't take as long as you want. Of course you can. But my point is just there's a lot of sources. You've got to kind of plan this out. What do you actually need and what don't you need? And so a couple ways to do this is to think about maybe rationalizing those data sources and figuring out is there a need or not in the business. So, for example, if the business need for making, let's say, the PSTs was originally because something like a limitation in your on-prem archiving solution, but the business actually does need all that data, then you can't really rationalize it down and say just get the on-prem archive. You need to get everything. You've got to think about those kinds of issues and whether or not the business needs it or not. There's a huge kind of shift, and I think you guys are starting to see this. We see this very much so when I'm talking to a lot of customers and vendor sponsor type companies as well, is this shift of it used to be that all of us were IT. We used to dictate what the company could do. Here's what we have to offer. Instead, it's switched around. And it's kind of funny because when I started in IT, it was called IS. It was Information Services. And we had file and print services, and we swapped out PCs and stuff 20-something years ago, right? It wasn't very detailed and high-tech. And then it suddenly went to IT. And in a lot of ways, we're switching back to IS. Not as a term that everyone's using. I don't think it's ever going to go away, IT. But in terms of what we're actually doing, in some ways, we're not even providing the technology. We're just simply servicing it. We're servicing our client, that is the organization as a whole, and they're dictating to us as our customer more and more every day. We're starting to see that they're dictating to us what it is that we need to give them as a business, as a customer rather. So kind of coming back full circle, the whole idea of looking at these different data sources, you got to figure out what the business need is for them and then figure out how you can get those in. You've also got to think about all those other previous factors we talked about, security issues, the compliance issues, data fidelity, chain of custody, all those kinds of things come in play. And then there's always an issue around performance in terms of, and Darwin, maybe we could talk about this in a minute or two here, but there's going to be a limitation in terms of how much data can Microsoft ingest. There is a limit. They don't have an unlimited pipe just to keep sucking everyone else's archive data in. There will be a limit. You've got to think about some of that performance and whether or not the extended period of time that will come into play because of that limitation, if that's an issue or not for your company. I think most companies are going to say, nope, we're only going to take 2 weeks and we're not going to go a minute longer. Of course not, but you just got to at least keep that in mind a little bit. So, Darwin, I named a couple sources here, and all these sources end up in sum total kind of become this massive archive data set that's got to be migrated. I guess you touched on this just ever so briefly beforehand, a couple minutes back on another slide, but which one of those data sources that our audience might be having to migrate over do you think is most problematic?
Hopefully, this one will resonate with the audience, but what we see is journals tend to be the most problematic. It's basically your entire history. So they tend to be either massive, if you've kept them in one journal, or very fragmented, if they're in multiple journals. And the information that you have in there is gold dust. If you've retained it and you need to use it for rediscovery, that's definitely the most problematic to move across.
Would you go into a little detail of why? Give the audience, assume that these guys in the audience haven't even done anything like this. Tell them why it's the most problematic.
So there's an amount of data that's stored around the email messages within the journal that you need to retain that won't necessarily be there once the email is sent. So things like blind carbon copies and other envelope information. While that's stored in the journal, that has to be pulled across in such a way that you retain that information. And that's really quite challenging.
Sorry, I had my thing on mute again. I try to make sure that I'm silent when you're talking there. That's a good point. You guys, when you're thinking about moving data in your archive up, it's not just about having a copy of the email in Office 365. Remember that an archive, the purpose of an archive isn't just to have a copy of something that was sent. It's to have a copy of what was communicated and how it was communicated. And so your example, Darwin, of the blind carbon copy is a great one, because if I just simply was to copy up the old mailboxes up and just kind of extend how much data is in someone's mailbox and just make it bigger, I might lose some of those who was blind carbon copied and so on, and then it no longer becomes an accurate record of communication. It just becomes kind of a copy of something that was sent but isn't necessarily going to hold up from a legal standpoint. Would you agree?
Yeah, and the same is true of things like distribution lists, which change over time. But within the journal, those distribution lists are captured at a point in time. So it's critical that they're retained.
No, that's a good point there. I talked a little bit about performance issues. I'm going to kind of go down that path for just a moment here. Have you seen, can you kind of address maybe for the audience from your own experience, any kind of bandwidth constraints, throughput, those kind of things in terms of getting data ingested into Office 365 and how that might impact the performance of a migration?
Yeah, okay. So for those who don't know, there are throttling policies in place when you're ingesting data into Office 365, and they will kick in per mailbox. So you have to be very careful about how you approach that, and therefore the sequencing of the migration and sort of handling any unexpected issues that you might get is the difference between a short migration and a potentially very long one.
And so that makes good sense as well, just from a standpoint of for you guys, you think of the sequencing, you're going to have to figure out which ones definitely need to be there. Is there an order in which they need to be? I love the fact that you talk about the handling of any issues. That's got to be also part of the consideration here as well. Other question I'm thinking about is, from your experience, if we've got somebody in the audience who's thinking, I want to move everything into Office 365, and you talked about this a little bit, dependent on the right plan, but can they make everything fit in Office 365? And I'm thinking about this not just from a storage standpoint. I'm thinking about this also from a usability, a discoverability, a chain of custody, a data fidelity, even these issues around the blind carbon copies and things like that. Can they make this all fit into Office 365?
Yeah, I mean, technically yes, but the big question is, should you? And we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I did say that yes, with virtually unlimited storage, you can put as much as you like in there, but then you're just adding a significant amount of noise around the data that you want to review. So, I mean, things like if there was a bake sale in 2006, do you really want to know about that email in future? It's about being judicious about what you take across. But yeah, those larger volumes, again, our experiences, those larger volumes just make it difficult and more time consuming to do any data operation, including things like e-discovery.
Yeah, the more isn't always merrier in the case of having too much data.
Absolutely.
Now, we've covered a couple of challenges and kind of gave some sub-challenges that kind of tie into play here for the audience to be thinking about, and I think it's a lot that they have to consider overall. And so I want to ask you a question, and I know that you're obviously, in this question you're going to be a little biased because you're a vendor that does migrations. But so let me ask you, and try to give me as much of a vendor-neutral answer as you possibly can. Can the audience do this on their own? Is there some parts they definitely can, and some parts they definitely probably can't? Can you give them some idea there so they know where their limits are going to be?
Absolutely. And I'm only biased, Nick, because we're awesome. I'll just sort of sneak that one in there.
Okay, we're tremendous. You should buy us right now. Okay, great. Well
absolutely. Listen, if I can't sell here, where can I sell? I'm just kidding. So yeah, I mean, there are always things that you can do to support the migration and to help with the project control. And if it is a small migration, you may be able to do it yourself and go it alone. But our experience is that those types of projects are few and far between. And what we tend to find is those people who do that will try and do it manually, and it takes a lot of manpower to do it manually, which is a big commitment for many people. The free tools that you can get, and there are free tools that you can get to do some of these migrations, don't necessarily lend themselves to ease of use, and you can tie yourself up in knots pretty quickly, and then it becomes probably harder to unpick than it would do to start out with somebody who's done it before. So our experience is that generally that there's not a huge amount that people can do, but certainly around the planning and communication, grouping of users, for instance. Somebody inside the business will know a lot better whether you should migrate your execs first or last. So those sort of things, absolutely, you can add value to, but just buyer beware when it comes to doing it yourself.
I would say if you're doing it yourself, they go last because you want to work out all the kinks so that their experience is flawless.
Absolutely, that would be my bet.
Yeah, exactly. You want a high-profile, low-risk kind of project. All right, so let me do this. I've got a quick summary slide I want to run through here with you guys and the audience, and then, Darwin, I know you've got some slides to run through. And then if you guys have some questions, I got a couple questions already coming in. Make sure you guys put those into the Q&A box. We'll be happy to answer those. But let me just kind of go through this. The goal here is to make sure you've got a complete migration. And, again, what is complete kind of depends on you in a lot of ways. At the end, it's about the data, and I've got just a couple things that we've talked about here. You've got to decide which data is going to get moved. We're trying to give you a high-level overview here, and that was the point of today's conversation, was really to kind of elevate the thinking a little bit about, well, you have to think about what data you actually need to move, how much data is going to get moved, like those things around retention policies and so on. When you're thinking about how to move the data, it isn't just about what tool do I use. It's about how I move the data, and is it going to meet the business requirements put upon that data for those things like e-discovery, for compliance, and so on. And then sort of the question of where are you going to be storing that, whether that's just in Office 365? Is it going to be put in within the mailbox itself? Is it put into a journal online up in Office 365? Where are you actually going to store the data as well? And I think that Darwin's going to talk a little bit more to that factor in a little bit here. So with that, Darwin, I'm going to give you the reins. And then when you're done, we'll do some Q&A. And like I said, we've got some questions coming in. You guys in the audience, make sure you still keep putting questions in, and we'll be happy to answer that. So Darwin, take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. So hi, everybody. There we go. So we're in our slides now. So thanks for joining the session. So as you heard earlier, I'm Darwin Lee. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for TransVault. And the reason for these slides is I'd really like to try and help you on your journey to Office 365. Some of that will just be simple advice, and some will be to explain how our products will make that journey easier for you. And also, I'll point out some gotchas along the way, and in the hope that you'll benefit from our experience. So let's start with this. Generally, the reason that we find that people are doing this is they're on a journey. So moving to Office 365 is normally a sign that an organization is making a wider change. But you're dealing with one of the most important parts, which is email, the lifeblood of many organizations, and it's ubiquitous. If you don't know, there's about 200 billion emails sent every day. So that's over 70 trillion emails a year that are sent. And that number's rising. So it's no wonder that organizations turn to email archives to manage that volume. Now, mailboxes contain what you can easily see, but the big question is what's actually below the surface? So what we're finding is that the contents of third-party archives that we move to Office 365 are getting bigger. And we're looking at an average now of around 17 terabytes per archive versus maybe a couple of terabytes just 2 short years ago. And in fact, some organizations have the majority of their enterprise emails stored in archives. And that's not really surprising because the average enterprise has been archiving for over a decade. And it's quite common that there will be at least 4 times the amount of staff represented in the archive than in the mailboxes, representing those who've left the organization. And we talked about that a bit earlier. And even after the mailboxes and the archives, there's still some other big repositories that need to get tackled when you move. And these raise their own challenges. And those include things like public folders, journals, and our old friend, the PST file, which we'll talk about in a while. And we'll go through each of those to try and help you decide on your approach. So migrating third-party archives. So when you're moving your archive, you need to ensure that you've got good handling of shortcuts, and it's important that any anomalies are handled and that your shortcuts are properly rehydrated when you migrate. You also need to consider the performance of the migration. And as we said earlier, as Nick rightly said, pushing large volumes of data into Office 365 will see you met with the automatic throttling barrier that you get to control the load on the Office 365 servers. So TransVault's got built-in solutions to maximize that throughput into Office 365. By managing that throttling, we have a technology called Confluence Stream that will help with that and make sure that you're migrating at the fastest pace possible. And we can also schedule your migration activity to suit your timing needs. So, for instance, we can vary the pace of migration during each 24-hour period to give you sort of ultimate flexibility and control. So two approaches really to doing this. We've got the archive first and what we're calling here lockstep. So we recommend, if you've got in-place archives, that you populate these first and move the mailboxes afterwards. So I said I'd point out some gotchas. A gotcha here is to consider how and when you stop users from adding to their existing archive when you move them across and then switch them over. The good news there is that our software and our partners will handle that for you because that's quite complex. The other approach that we've got there is lockstep, and that's where you move the mailbox first and then the archive immediately afterwards, user by user. Now, interestingly, the same gotcha applies there, but also the same solution. So you just have to be very careful about how and when you migrate each user across and how you communicate. So we talked a little bit about levers earlier. So inactive mailboxes, I think they're sometimes called dead or orphaned users. So what you need to do is migrate the data, applying a retention policy, and then remove the account, and the data is then retained. So this is a very cost-effective solution to migrating levers, as the license is then used serially for each lever as they're processed. And just to explain that a little bit more, you migrate so you have an Office 365 license, which is used to then migrate a lever's information into Office 365, and then you basically close that down, you reuse the license. The data will stay there, it's still discoverable, but there is no license over the top of it. It means you can reuse that license elsewhere. There's another gotcha there. So while the account is active, so before you've actually taken that license away and reused it, during the migration of the data, any retention policy can be set. So most often for a lever, we set what's called an in-place hold, which is just a global hold of all that information. But you can set retention rules as well. And in those retention rules, if you set any deletion rules, if you set those before the account becomes inactive, those will continue after the account is taken away. So you need to be careful what you set up, otherwise you might find that that data is slowly being diminished over time. Public folders. So Microsoft now have quite an interesting solution called modern public folders. So for a while, Microsoft tried to move customers away from public folders, but many enterprises love them. They've invested a huge amount of time and effort and business processes in public folder technology, and they've ended up with extremely large public folders. So the public folder structure that we know on Exchange 2010 and 2013 is different from that in Office 365. So the new structure builds on the default mailbox architecture, but with quite a clever growth capability that's automatically taken care of behind the scenes. So it's called the modern public folder, and this is how it works. So you kick off with a single primary public folder mailbox, which can grow up to 50 gig in size, and these are values that are currently active. The mailbox comprises of an index or a hierarchy and the content of that mailbox. Office 365 then detects when a public folder mailbox is approaching the 50 gig limit and uses an auto split feature. And it's a background process that does the following. So it creates a linked secondary public folder overspill mailbox and a read-only index. It automatically rebalances contents across the mailboxes, and it then updates the primary and secondary indexes to reflect the location of the new items. So that expansion continues until you hit an overall limit, and right now I believe that's 50 terabytes in a single Office 365 tenancy. Now to you and I, it's this series of group mailboxes looks just like one virtual mailbox to end users, so it will act in exactly the same way as it does right now. Now there's a gotcha here as well, which is this rebalancing and re-indexing process can take some time. It can take a number of days up to maybe a couple of weeks for that to complete, and that means special attention needs to be paid when you're migrating public folders, and that's something that we and our partners can help you do very safely. So a bit more on that gotcha, just to expand. So waiting 2 weeks isn't usually a problem when you're populating a public folder during normal use, but when you're in the midst of a big migration, you'll be pushing data into Office 365 at quite a fast rate. And Office 365 just won't recalibrate itself fast enough. So therefore, what we suggest here is to take the Office 365 public folder size restriction of 50 gig per mailbox into consideration, and effectively run scripts to chunk up or break down your public folders into separate public folders that are less than 50 gig in size before you start your move. We suggest that then you check your chunks are split according to logical subfolders. just to make sure that your data is logically grouped. And then once migrated, you can use PowerShell then to regenerate the necessary indices and therefore not waiting for the slow crawl. So there's many other considerations to take on board to ensure the best outcome post-move, such as ensuring optimum retrieval times by putting public folders in a geographic location that's near to users that will be accessing it. But there's no difference of that than any other sort of hosting and tenancy question. So we talked a bit about journals earlier. So if you're journaling in Exchange, you won't be in Office 365 because there's no longer any journal capability. So that's an immediate gotcha. However, I do have some advice for you here about how to retain the same functionality and how to handle your legacy journals. And we'll move on to that now. So in Exchange, on the left-hand side, on-premises Exchange, you have a single instance dedicated mailbox to store your journal, with all addressee metadata stored alongside the emails themselves. On the right-hand side there in Office 365, you simply put user's mailbox on in-place hold. Now the emails that are stored there are permanently retained in the respective users' mailboxes. Distribution lists are expanded, and any blind carbon copies, BCCs, are in the sender's sent items. So if a user deletes an email from their mailbox while it's under in-place hold, the message simply moves to a hidden folder called the recoverable items folder, which is still discoverable even if a search is carried out. Now, it is possible to have a hybrid approach if you wanted to retain your journal on premises, but that's also a gotcha, and I'll explain that later. So that solves the problem for new mail, but what about your legacy journals? So TransVault has a unique tool called Compliance Time Machine. And what that will do is it'll migrate your legacy journals into Office 365 mailboxes as if to rewind and replay time, hence the time machine bit. So compliance is critical for your email data, and we handle this with full chain of custody, which I'll explain shortly. And our partners are experienced to plan these journal migrations, which, as I said earlier, are quite complex, and to use this tool efficiently and effectively. But basically what this tool will do is it will make sure that email appears in users' mailboxes as if that's where it always was. And that's a very, very clever piece of technology. So, PSTs, or personal storage tables. So these are local stores of data, and for those who don't know, they're created by users to store data locally, or they can already be created by the auto-archive feature of Outlook. And with the mobility aspect of cloud migration, it doesn't really sit well with our objectives there. So I strongly urge you to address these now or feel the pain later, and I'll explain a bit more about that towards the end. So, if you've ever heard the advice, if you've ever moved house, to clear out the attic or the loft before you move house, the same's true here. And we did talk about this earlier. We have tools which will help remove duplicates and even apply retention policies to remove old data across distributed PST files, some geographically distributed PST files, and strongly advise that this is done to shorten the migration and reduce the volume of data that you're storing. And look for scalability. There are many tools out on the market to help you deal with PSTs. Some tools are very good for small volumes and when you've got all of your data in one place, but I think we all know that the real world isn't like that. Make sure that the solution matches the problem or you run the risk of losing data integrity. And when you lose data integrity, you look like this. So let's talk about data integrity during the migration and how to avoid looking like this guy when you're done. So chain of custody we talked about earlier. And what I've drawn out here is a great example of how not to do it. This is a service that is offered, but we would strongly advise that this isn't really the right way to approach the problem. So chain of custody in this instance is quite simply the ability to evidence that your emails have been safely moved without being altered in any way. So in the example here, which is the one solution that is offered, you manually extract all of your mail data into multiple PST files and then put them on disk. Then you provide a CSV file, which has got a map between those PSTs and the mailboxes, and then you save it to a drive, and you give it to a courier. That courier then dutifully gets on his bike or in his car, and will take it to Microsoft, who will then stick it on a shelf behind the ones which arrived before yours, and then upload it using the mapping CSV file that you laboriously created earlier. Then at the end there, you can see you have a glass of wine at the end to celebrate, until you realize, unfortunately, you dropped the ball. It's a gotcha. You lost your chain of custody, and that means your data is no longer reliable in a legal situation. To avoid that gotcha, you need to always use a solution where chain of custody is preserved. And you'll be pleased to know that TransVault provides a full chain of custody report for all migrations performed with its software. So finally, I really wanted to come slightly outside of just pure email and think a bit more wider about Office 365 and really reiterate the reasons why we see people moving to Office 365 and the enterprise benefits that TransVault will help you achieve. So firstly there, you can cut costs. And moving to this scalable model in the cloud, you can remove your on-premises hardware, all the maintenance contracts and the overhead to maintain them. So that's a good cost saving. Secondly, you can achieve good governance. So using the approaches I've outlined and avoiding the gotchas, hopefully, you can get better control of your data. Mobility. Now, this is surely one of the biggest benefits. So people can now access their email from any device, anywhere, and actually any of their files anywhere if you're using Office 365 correctly. So just be sure to avoid the security gotcha and ensure that you've got the right data protection tools and policies in place. Finally, there's staff productivity. So remember I said earlier about a gotcha relating to a hybrid environment with an on-premises journal? Well, if you retain data in two places, you've now doubled the effort for anyone doing a search, and they're unlikely to thank you for that. So staff can be more productive with the ability to access and search data in one place. And obviously with everything now in one place, you now have one-stop e-discovery and a simple, fast way to find that necessary data. And at the very end there, what we've got is better business intelligence. So you've addressed your PST problem because hopefully you followed my advice. You've migrated all of your mail in mailboxes and archives safely with full chain of custody. You've got full access to all of that data. And because you've now moved to Office 365 and you're taking advantage of the benefits of cloud storage, SharePoint Online, and things like Office Graph, you've now got a new and unparalleled access to intelligence about your business. So if you've got any questions, then please start typing them now, and we'll answer them at the end of this slide. But really, the point for this is what's next? Well, you can chat to us now about your requirements, and we're online and ready to help at www.transvault.com. Or alternatively, we can connect you with a TransVault partner who can assist you further. If you just drop us an email to info@transvault.com, we'll happily make that connection. So thank you for your time, and I wish you all every success with your move to Office 365.
Fantastic work. Appreciate that, Darwin. I was looking at all the slides you got. I'm going, is he going to get done? You masterfully did that. That was really good. So let's do this here. I've got a number of questions coming in, and let's go ahead and go through some of these. So you mentioned, and I know you answered this, but this is from Sean. He says, with Time Machine, does it auto-place the data in the hidden recoverable items for in-place holds, or will the user need to purge those emails again?
Great question, Sean. So they will be placed wherever they should be placed, and if they should be placed in the recoverable items folder, they will be placed there. So if they've effectively been deleted, they will be put in the recoverable items folder.
All right, and another question from Sean. How do you recommend migrating an archive that's just a journaling of all mailboxes combined into a single mailbox?
Sorry, Nick, can you repeat the question?
No, that's fine. No, what's the recommendation around basically migrating an archive that's a single journaled mailbox? If all they have is one
I'd
journal, what's your recommendation then? Yeah.
Okay, so the recommendation there is if you use Compliance Time Machine, that will do it all for you effectively.
That was an easy answer.
But Sean, if that's not a good enough answer, then drop me an email and I'll expand on that for you.
Wonderful. That works. Alan asks, is it possible to directly migrate email in Exchange 2007 to Office 365?
Yes.
Yeah, that's an easy. Yeah, I like your answers, man. Just shorten to the point. It's good. We're gonna be out of here early. Yes, we're all going home early.
That's not the intent, Nick, and you know it. It is a very straightforward answer, and the answer is yes. Speak to any of our partners, and they'll help you do it.
I wasn't teasing you. It's actually, I'm glad because I've webinars with people, and you guys in the audience, you've been on these where we ask a question and they take like 9 minutes to answer a question. It was just one question. So I actually love your answer because it's not 9 minutes. Awesome.
Yeah, you'll get succinct from me, but if that's not enough, I'm really happy to speak to anybody after the session.
Yeah, no, we're doing just fine. Paul asks, what would be a good way to migrate an Enterprise Vault version 9 to Office 365?
Well, you know the answer is going to be via TransVault software.
Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? Yeah.
So it's a good way to migrate an Enterprise Vault V9 to Office 365. Again, the Enterprise Vault V9 we fully support. In fact, it's one of our most common migrations. Very practiced at that. Again, there's lots of gotchas in there with Enterprise Vault. I'm going to go into a 9-minute response now, Nick. Okay, I just thought I'd forewarn you.
You're allowed. You've banked up enough time. You can do that. It's okay.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. So Enterprise Vault, we've got two methods to access the data. We have a direct method and we have the API method. So we can actually access, the TransVault software can access the Enterprise Vault data store directly, which means that we can actually extract data from Enterprise Vault faster than you can get it through the API. So it's a very, very efficient and effective way of getting data out of Enterprise Vault. But yeah, we do that as standard. It's one of the most common things that we do. But thanks for the question.
That wasn't 9 minutes. You lied.
Okay, I lied.
Adrian wants to know, where does your product rate in Gartner reviews?
That's a very good question. I know that we've done some analyst briefings with Gartner in the past. The general response is that we're quite highly regarded. I mean, we effectively started this industry in 2006. We were the first business in this area. We were the first to be validated, if you like, by Microsoft and Veritas or Symantec. So we're very highly respected, and we have petabytes worth of experience of migrating. Again, very happy to speak to you, Adrian, at any point in time if you want to know more about example projects that we've run. And our credibility in the industry.
I love the petabytes answer. I was thinking oodles and oodles of data, and I don't think that's quite as credible as petabytes, so that's good.
Well, we're getting to the point where single projects now are moving towards petabyte scale.
Oh, is it ridiculous? Get there.
It's exciting.
Yes, it is. It's making things good. So we've got 2 more minutes here. So a question around how do you price the migration came in from Steve.
We price it basically on volume, so terabytes of storage.
All right, and then the last one here that I think we have time for was, how do I buy the software?
So you would approach any of our partners. Again, if you go to drop us an email at info@transvault.com. or give us a call. We'll be quite happy to connect you with a partner in your area. And we have, many, many partners worldwide who will be very, very happy to help.
Look at that, and just like that, we are at the top of the hour. We are a team, man. It is like grease lightning fast here. We're like a.
You set me up well, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah, I try. So everyone there in the audience, appreciate your attendance today. We hope you got something out of it. Trying to focus on the challenges, give you kind of a high-level exposure to the things that are going to happen during an archive migration. Darwin, thank you for a really good conversation today. I think it really helped create a lot of context around the problem. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, glad you were here today. And with that, everyone, we're going to conclude the webinar. So I'm going to hand things over to Ashley.
All right. Thank you, Nick and Darwin. Nick, you kind of stole my show. I'm just going to remind everyone that for more information on today's topic, please go to transvault.com, and this web seminar will be available on demand starting tomorrow, so feel free to come back and review. Thank you again for attending, and have a great day.